So I think maybe we should start because, and some people will maybe come in. And my only role here, I'm Tamsin. I'm the director of the Impact Trust, the director of the Resilience Funders Network, and a principal 10 champion with Wings. And we have Benjamin and Liana here this evening, which is wonderful, and Stan from Omega. And this is really the first of our autumn dialogues on navigating the human predicament or polycrisis or whatever wording we use, but particularly an interesting conversation to reflect on four people's experience and insights, or five people, sorry, and I'm sure some of you may have been there, but experience and insights from Climate Week and from the Summit of the Future, which of course is of great interest in terms of all of our work. So I'm going to hand over to Tom, who is going to moderate. I would like to really invite you to please put comments and questions in the chat at any point, and we will circle back to those. There will be an initial conversation between Tom and the four people, Pupil and Erica from Horizon 2045, Benjamin, as I'm sure you know, from Wings, and Melody from Climate Kick, along with Tom from the Impact Trust, Stan from Omega, who were all present last week. So Tom, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tamsin, and thanks everyone for their interest in this. We're going to minimize the kind of the formalities and the introductions and any warm-up exercise because I think people are excited about just jumping right into this. And so if you don't mind, let's get into the practice of using the chat box to express ideas. Just please, in the chat, tell us your name and where you're calling in from so we can begin to use that practice as a way of engaging. And we'll see where people are coming in from, because I see friends from around the world here. So just please, in the chat, put your name and where you're calling in from, and then we'll get right into it. And as Tamsin said, we're going to start off with brief kind of presentations from four people who were actually at the summit last week and Climate Week. And then we're going to talk about lessons learned, high points, low points. Then feel free to have questions and put those in the chat. We'll draw up on the chat as opposed to raising your hand all the time. Just put it in the chat. We'll try to get back to that and have some questions and answers. And then we'll try to evolve into a collective conversation among all of us. And kind of let's do away with the formalities and let's have an open conversation among everyone here. And then we'll give a few moments at the end for people to have last thoughts and next steps. Okay. So great. Oh my gosh, look at all these folks coming in from different parts of the world. That's great. So we're going to talk about kind of what your high points and low points are. And what were your key takeaways? So if you don't mind, Erica, could you start us off and tell us, yeah.
Clever to start with the person in the earliest time zone. So high points and low points, is that where we're starting?
Yeah, and the organization that you represent as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So hello, I'm Erica Gregory, and I'm president of Horizon 2045. And our organization is supporting decision makers who are about to make important decisions with long tail consequences. And our hope is that we'll do that together by looking at the intersections between the different issues that we're all working on. And I suppose in a way, my high point and low point are actually related to each other because Thomas, you and I discussed the other day, I don't know how many people on this call know this, but the Pact for the Future, which has been a labor of many people for the last couple of years, almost didn't happen at the Summit for the Future. Because of conversations and objections about language dealing both with nuclear disarmament obligations and gender parity considerations. And the nuclear piece in particular, so the reason obviously this is a low point is, and I'm happy to talk more about this later, Tom, that we are actually at a moment where our colleague and friend from this community, Lori Laybourne, talks about derailment risk. And in fact, an issue that many people rarely think about, which is nuclear weapons, almost hijacked the success of this initiative, which which champions the work that we're all doing in this community. And so on one hand, that's a low point because it really does point to the challenges of multilateralism at the moment and these fundamental mental models that are still in existence in ways that are really not helpful to us. And the high point, I mentioned this as a high point because it actually gives us a way in to talk about these icebergs, these things that are just below the surface, but could actually blow up the good work that we're all doing, and the importance of thinking about the overlaps between these issues, from climate to nuclear weapons to poverty alleviation to gender parity. So lots more to say about that, but I would say that event captures both for me, Tom.
Okay, thanks, Erica. And if you don't mind, Melody, let's turn to you, and if you'll tell us about your high points, low points, and your takeaways.
Yeah, so I think my high point is actually literally very high. So we were on the 64th floor of the One World Trade Center. So if our consciousness wasn't lifted, or we definitely were lifted physically up there. And one of my friends actually said she hasn't been any 64th floor, 64th floor at anything. And thank you very much. But then at the same time, it's a bit surreal because we had two leaders from different cultures to talk about climate change with us, and they have very different messages. So we had the Amazon Secret Headwater. The tribe leader Domingo was talking to us about nature and how their relationship with nature is it's very different from how New York would look at it, because we to translate climate change into business language, we're saying, oh, we should put it on nature as a new asset class on the balance sheet. But what the indigenous leaders were saying is that nature is not something on the balance sheet for us. Nature is our mother. That's our relationship with nature, right? So, and we are high up in New York with Manhattan, the view of Manhattan right there. So it's a little bit surreal to talk about nature and just not like surrounded by it in a way, and surrounded by a kind of symbol of capitalism as well. The second talk that we had there up on the 64th Sky Bar is from Frederick Shaw, who is the leader of a fourth generation family business in Singapore. And what strikes me about his talk, which is definitely the most profound insight I've heard so far, is that he was asked by my CEO, Kirsten Dunlop. So I work for Climate Geek. And so her question is that, what is the most surprising thing to you in the past decades? And he said, I'm just surprised that love is not what people think love is. Like we we see love as a romantic feeling. We see love as something that that we have bear with another person. But for him, love is something different. Love starts with loss. When you have loss, you feel love, and then you start to have a bit of a sadness and also a bit of joy, and then arise the care. So for him, he think love starts with loss, and then love is care, which means that love is not feeling, but action. So that's what he hopes that we could get from all of our talks and thoughts about climate and our thoughts about nature, and just actually show love with care. So that's definitely a highlight for me, and I can't stop thinking about it. And also another thing that he mentioned is that from an Asian perspective, change comes from more of an inside out thing instead of outside in, which means that in the West, more in the Western perspective, is that we look at everything as a system that is outside of us, which means that, we want to change the system, we want to shift the system. We want to create a financial facility to do this. We want to create this and that. And that's what we're talking about in New York, right? Like, we don't have enough financial, we don't have enough assets, we don't have enough this and that, technology, startups, finance. But the change for in the Asian perspectives has to be inside out. It's not about system, it's about ourselves, right? Like, how can we change ourselves from the inside, and then we can change the world. So, and it's actually echoes what Kumi Naidu is another session I was in Ford Foundation was saying, is that he was talking about art. Art changes people and people changes the world. So that's another, like the Ford Foundation session is another one where he actually also talked about loss. When he went to Greenland to see the glacier, he said the whole ship of people did not talk about degrees. They did not talk about carbon. They did not talk about anything technology, but they just feel this, right? Like things hitting them in the face. So it's definitely those words that have nothing to do with technicalities. That's something that is a highlight for me during this week, and it's very profound. The low point, I think it's definitely about not enough people talking about mindset change and people talking too much about the siloed approach, right? Like we're talking, like I said, we're talking about technology, we're talking about financials, we're talking about all these vertical things, but not enough people talking about the horizontal integration, how polycrisis, right? Like how polycrisis and climate change, all of these things are intersections with each other, how we can change it, because all of us know that climate change is not dementia. Climate change is not cancer. There is no cure for those things, but we know there's solutions for climate change. And we know what it is as well. We're just not doing it. So that is definitely a low point for me because, that's what I'm wondering. Why are we not doing this? Why are we not changing ourselves, right? So those are some first reflections.
Oh, thanks, Melody. That's very poignant and very on spot. And even Erica talked about the intersections and adjacencies. And Pupil, how about yourself? What were your takeaways and what were your high points and low points?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Erica and Melody, for those great reflections. I would say for me, at a personal level, the high point was it felt very much like a full circle moment. Because 3 years ago, I had the honor of speaking at UNGA when the Our Common Agenda report had just come out. And that's the report that proposed the summit taking place in 2024. So coming back, I also have worked with a lot of people who were quite instrumental in shaping up the pact. So to see all of that hard work actually materialize and become a big thing, and to be there for something like the Pact of the Future to be adopted. It's imperfect, but it is also historic. It is important because, with all its imperfections and gaps, it still embodies, I think, exactly the kind of ambitions and values that we will need to embody as a global community if we have any shot at facing the challenges and coming out on the other side, and building a future that's really for the majority of us on this planet, because right now that's not the future that we're building. So I think in terms of the wins of the summit, there were quite a few that I feel like do represent a paradigm shift in how we understand and practice international cooperation. A few things that really stood out to me in the Pact of the Future was first, the commitment to reforming the UN Security Council. I think that's a huge one because for years there's been so many frustrations. There's a growing cry from the international community that it is outdated, it is underrepresentative of the membership of the UN. And so now that it's codified in this pact, there is at least some hope, and also just recognition that global institutions, the way they exist, they're designed to exist that way, but there's nothing inevitable about that design. And so just in the way that we conceived of them in a certain form at a time when they were born, we can also, just with the same commitment, re-envision them when the times change. So I think that's quite monumental. The Global Digital Compact, it was about time that something around global digital governance became part of international conversations. I actually think it's quite late, but at least it's there now. So for the international community to come together and say, okay, how are we going to collectively govern technology? How are we going to think about the kinds of gaps that exist, as opposed to just constantly focusing on the shiny promise of the digital revolution, feels like a step in the right direction. And then the third step in the right direction, I would say, is definitely also the most exciting parts of the pact, which is the annex on the Declaration of the Future Generations. And so I think, as there were also other things like, moving away from looking at GDP as a lens of measuring progress and development, around financial reform, ultimately about long-term thinking. For those of us who have been doing strategic foresight on this call, we know that these are the kinds of ideas that have been coming up for decades. In foresight work, we have constantly been envisioning. Erica mentioned the point about leadership. We've not had a woman secretary general, and in a variety of foresight projects that I've been part of in my not very long career, but also before that, foresight practitioners and decision makers who do see a value in long-term thinking have explored these ideas. But I think what makes this moment historic is now they're more formally part of something that, at least on paper, the international community agrees to follow. But I guess the biggest gap, or I would say the obvious next step, is that how do we actually move from these bold statements and commitments, and what do the binding actions actually look like? I think that was not adequately explored and discussed during the summit, and that tends to be such a recurring problem in any process such as this. So I think, these big summits, they're really so good at building attention and building momentum, and then it gets over and the leaders are done with their speeches and their posturing. Everybody takes a flight and goes back home, and then what happens? So I think that's the piece that we need to focus on. For me, the parts of next action that I am most curious about, first is coming to the Declaration of the Future Generations. It outlines the need to set up, and now there's agreement to set up, a special UN envoy to make sure that those commitments are translated into action. I think it's going to be really critical in how the responsibilities and role and power of that envoy is envisioned, is that we don't continue to think of that through the lens of all the envoys on other matters that have existed in the past. If it's the envoy for the future, we really need to break out of the mold of how we think about their role in the system. I think one of the most hard-hitting sessions that I attended at the United Nations headquarters was the Youth-Led Action Days, which happened on the Saturday. And that was really such a rare opportunity to hear from young activists and movers and shakers who are doing the real work on the ground. And the Secretary General, very surprisingly, took a lot of demonstrated a lot of accountability, to go as far as saying that it is my generation that messed things up, and now we're doing too little too late, and the younger people who have the ideas, who have the commitment, we're also not really letting them lead. And that needs to be the next step in international cooperation, is to let the people who are going to live the longest with the consequences of the decisions being made today be actually the people, not just providing input and being the voice in the room, but actually the ones leading and taking charge, and the ones that are equipped with the right kind of agency and power in the system. So I will pause there.
Thanks, Pupil. And that's a brilliant segue into Benjamin, because he talks a lot about who's at the table and whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard. And even I'll quote you, Pupil. You said that one of the youth stood up and said, yes, we're coming to the table, and we have the space now to talk, but what we say is falling on silent ears. So, Benjamin, who's at the table? And please tell us about your experience, the highs and the lows.
Great. Well, thank you, and great to hear everyone's insights. Actually, a lot of the points I wanted to share as highlights were the same as Pupul's, and so I won't repeat that. But I think that indicates something, especially this recognition of the need for a change in the global governance and in the international finance architecture. Indeed, has been advocated for years. And in previous events I attended, may that be the high-level political forum or other UNGAs, we could feel the pressure, getting stronger, and the cause being more and more pressing and urgent. And we had some really, interesting also speeches this year, with including Lula, the Brazil's president's speech, that was very strongly advocating for that reform of the UN system and the finance architecture. And so we're seeing this now translated into commitments. Of course, let's see what commitments become, but I think it's a milestone. It's to see that there's a roadmap, there's an agenda. It's in the plans, in the pipe to revise the system. And I think it tells us a little bit about, of course, the geopolitical shifts, and it feels almost like if the current multilateral system is in survival mode. I felt a bit like that. I mean, there's maybe an acknowledgement that it's just totally unsustainable to try to keep the architecture as it is, and so as slowly as possible, they're ready to revise it. So will it be fast enough so that the credibility of international institutions and multilateral bodies is not completely gone? So that's a question, but we're at a really unique moment, I think, in history, at least since World War II, and we can feel that, and it translates in our documents like this Pact for the Future. So that was interesting. On my end, of course, I always come with that philanthropy lens, where at Wings, we're a global network. We're trying to bring the philanthropy voice at the table. Tom, to your point about who's at the table, we want philanthropy to be at the table, but not philanthropy meaning the Gates Foundation or whatever foundation is big enough to have its own seat, but philanthropy as a stakeholder in all its diversity, geographically and in terms of philanthropy. So we push for that, and I must say philanthropy was not very much at the table. Actually, philanthropy is not mentioned at all in the Pact for the Future. That's well, so I mean, there's a mention, I think, in the digital compact, this annex. So there's a mention, but that's all we have. And so I think that's an issue, but it's also a reflection of how little foundations have invested in their own multilateral bodies. International foundations, are concerned about the crisis of multilateralism, and this growing nationalist trend, but international foundations have never invested in having a global collective voice for their field as a sector beyond their own direct engagements. And so Wings is trying to fill that gap, but paradoxically we're doing it mainly with taxpayer money, because foundations still have a hard time to just say, yeah, we need to a collective voice, and we need to pay for that. So that's a side note, but just saying, I think that that's also the outcome of that lack of collective voice. And of course, we're making progress. I mean, Wings with its members are more and more present in some of these spaces. We issued a statement with the OECD Net Forward, or we supported the statement of the OECD Net Forward to actually call on governments to really integrate philanthropy as a stakeholder, to think about multi-stakeholder partnerships, and how we can build bridges between different sectors. So, I mean, there was a lot, and maybe there's too much, and I know we'll have discussions. I would maybe mention one other point is a lot of the discussions I was involved in were around locally led development. And there's a huge momentum around that because USAID and a number of bilateral and multilateral cooperations have made commitments, and some US foundations too. And so just to let you know a bit of some of the discussions around that at least Wings has been trying to push with our partners and members has really been around localization or locally led development should not be seen as a sort of a narrow technical issue on how international donors can allocate more of their funding to local actors, which of course they need to do, and it's a starting point, but it's a much bigger conversation about rebuilding the aid system and building a post-aid world. And that means helping to nurture local ecosystems for civil society, for local civil society, including for local civil society's resourcing. So that means helping to grow local philanthropy, to build local networks, to stimulate local giving, and so on and so forth. So we've really, I think, been successful after a couple of years or a bit more of advocacy to influence that. We're starting to see USAID and others doing some work along these lines and understanding that if they want truly locally led development, they actually need to invest in local philanthropic ecosystems. So a lot of the conversations we were involved in were around that, and I'll be happy to share more. We also worked on climate, and mostly this year our focus around climate was trying to engage more the US market of foundations on the Philanthropy for Climate movement, because we have this movement with lots of partners around the world to get foundations that do not work on climate and environment to integrate that lens. There are more than 800 foundations that have signed, but only 11 in the US. So we were just saying, hey, what's the barrier in the US, and what can we do about that? So we had interesting discussions there, and seeing how we can overcome the sort of the divisiveness of this topic in a place like the US where it's very highly politicized. So anyway, a lot, very intense, and yeah, looking forward to continuing the discussion with everyone.
Okay, thanks, Benjamin. So I would ask the rest of the participants, please pose your questions in the chat, and let's begin to open this up to questions and discussion. And if anybody who actually just presented, while we're waiting for the people from Brazil, Italy, Hungary, South Africa, Istanbul, Canada, Berlin, the UK, Hungary, etc., people from all over, let's begin to populate some of your questions and ideas, and open up the discussion. And then those of you who have already spoken while we're waiting, please feel free to Melody, ask another question or have another contribution.
Yeah, I just have some reactions from Popo and Benjamin's reflection. One is on youth. I have attended a intergeneration conversation of youth leader and philanthropy leader hosted by Open Society Foundation. And what really is interesting is that one of the senior leader was saying, you need to work up the system. I was a youth leader when I was your age, and it took me 40 years to get where I am right now, and I'm still trying to change the system. And then he said, I have to run. So I was like, oh my God, the message is that you need 40 years to change what you want to change now, and you might not still see the change. And that's not the time that we need. We have, right? We don't have 40 years to change that. So that's one reflection that's really interesting. I mean, the conversation there. And another thing about youth leaders is that a lot of youth leaders who actually got to the United Nations are immigrants as well. Like me, as an immigrant, I know how difficult it is for immigrant to be like, you know, be ahead, to be a leader in this society. Like they mentioned that my English so bad, you know, they keep feeling sorry about their English when they're at the session, or, you know, so I just deeply feel for these young people. They're young and they're immigrant. They're fighting, you know, multiple battles, and they really need support. So what comes out of that is that, you know, youth really need support from us as well. It's not like they're just the magic bullet that is going to change everything. Another thing that, just to Benjamin's point on philanthropy, I still feel, first of all, the US philanthropy, obviously, this is in New York. It's very focused on US. I don't see a lot of other countries. A local philanthropy, as you mentioned, Benjamin, that represented in some of the mainstream events. And also, I was in a very interesting debate. The debate question is that, does climate change need US political leadership? And interestingly, my CEO is debating the four. So yes, we need American leadership because America, like it or not, already have the influence on climate change. But in the end, actually, the against side had won, which means that, hey, maybe it's time, like that ship has sailed. Maybe it's time that we forget about America. So so that's just some couple of reflections there to add on.
Okay, thanks, Melody. We're going to go to Pupil, who had her hand raised, and then Erica. And we might ask Michael to comment on climate change and American leadership. So,
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Melody, because it made me realize I never really shared my low point. And that was exactly connected to your second point, is that I'm from India. I'm not a US national. I live in New York right now. So the immense luck of being in those rooms in the UN is not lost on me. And I think I know so many people, my own collaborators, but also part of my broader network, who could not be there in New York that week because of something as simple as visa backlogs, right? So I think there are some really on the ground real challenges that continue to be barriers to participation. And so it's all well and good for us to talk about inclusivity and diversity, but really, how much of that are we actually achieving when we continue to hold these important discussions in the way we hold them in places that are really fortresses to the majority of the world, right? So I just wanted to underscore that's a huge problem, and it continued to be a problem even at the summit. And then to your earlier point about the leader's comment, that truly is quite sad and heartbreaking. And as somebody from the millennial generation, I also have, it's not unfamiliar to me. I have been on in rooms and talking about, are we willing to cede power, or, and then you have senior leaders in the room, in the audience, who say that, oh, maybe, try to work up your way into these systems within governments, within organizations. And while it is a quite realistic take on the actual situation, I think it also completely discounts the kind of agency that those of us have in our current roles and positions of powers to make even a 1-degree difference, right? So that people who are coming up behind us don't have to face the same kinds of challenges and barriers that we had to. So I think that when we talk about ceding power, when we talk about agency in systems, yes, there are really big, lofty goals around that, but there are also some very small, real changes that can be made today. And we all have different agency in enabling that. And so it's very important to not discount that.
okay, thanks, Pupil. Erica.
Yeah, so I just want to add another dimension to this conversation because just as for decades we've been talking about youth voice and how to make sure that we're bringing the voices of youth and marginalized people into the room and into the decision-making process, that's also been a conversation we've been having about women. And I do want to offer this. My sense was as I, excuse me, ran around New York like a lot of the rest of you, going from event to event, that really some of the, and maybe I would say most of the really extraordinarily interesting work going on is being led by women. And so something actually is changing. So I'm, 61 years old, and over the course of my career, I can say with some confidence that the landscape for women's leadership is in fact changing. Now, has it taken 40 years in the way that you're describing? Maybe it has taken longer than that, in fact, but we are on the cusp of something really important. So we had the good fortune of collaborating with the elders to launch a new women's network, with women leader working on global security issues. So I just want to say it was extraordinary, actually, to be in the room with former prime ministers, Helen Clark of New Zealand and Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, and Hina Jalani, an extraordinary human rights crusader from Pakistan on the Pakistani Supreme Court, uh, talking about their own experience over the course of decades as women, and talking about really in a way that I think is extremely unusual, talking to an intergenerational, very intimate group of people, including a 25-year-old Marshallese woman, about the fact that they had had to overcome crippling shyness, that they had had to overcome the feeling of not being welcome in a room. In fact, in this conversation, every woman in the room told their story about, in some cases, they were really positive stories, but in many cases, really difficult stories about the gender dynamics of getting to where they are today. And so that history, of course, is painful in many ways for a lot of women. But the fact of the matter is, we have turned a corner now, and there is something about to be unleashed, I would say, in this global network of women's networks. And in fact, there's an interesting opportunity at the moment to find ways to connect women across issue spaces, to really deeply look at these points of intersection in our work and to lead from a different place. And as you say, Pupil, to create space for people who would ordinarily not even feel the confidence to be in the room, let alone having the invitation to be in the room. So there is, I think, a little bit of cause for hope.
Yeah, Benjamin. And please populate the chat box with your questions and comments. And we want to circle back and make sure everyone, or those who are interested, can have a space to comment and
Yeah,
contribute.
thanks. No, just briefly, and I also look forward to hearing from Michael on the climate question and U.S. leadership. But just quickly on sort of the inclusiveness question and diversity of voices, I think, I mean, this is extremely important, and obviously there's a lot of work to be done to improve these dimensions. There are some really interesting and very concrete recommendations on the table about how to make, including international events, maybe that be policy events or philanthropy events, more inclusive. I think the MCLD, the Movement for Community-led Development, and maybe Civicus and others, they put together a whole guide actually telling foundations and others how you can be truly inclusive in all aspects and all work. So there are interesting proposals on the table. But just when it comes to wings, it's a big priority for us. I mean, that's one of the main added values we believe we can bring is that diversity of voices. So we're quite active at making sure we include, all kinds of philanthropies, including grassroots philanthropy, local, individual giving, women philanthropy, youth philanthropy, indigenous-led philanthropy. So we have all these subfields of the broader sector that are represented in the network. And then when we go to the UN or to other processes, global policy processes, then we always provide opportunities for these members to be there with us to engage with policymakers and others. So that's one of the things we do, is like bringing delegations. And just as an example, like for the G20, where we are co-chairing a working group, the first formal working group to have philanthropy's perspective on G20 and have philanthropy's recommendations. We created and co-chaired that group, and we had more than 400 organizations that have contributed insights. And so when we present these recommendations to government, they're truly diverse and reflecting perspectives from not just a few massive endowed global north foundations, but just the broader sector, which is much more diverse and people led than we think. So I just wanted to support everything we were super happy to have. I don't know if you mentioned, Erika, about Prospera, because Prospera is also the network of women's funds, the global network of women's funds, who have joined Wings recently. So we look forward to doing more work also around sort of women-led philanthropy, and bringing strengthening that voice in all these policy spaces as well.
Okay, thanks, Benjamin.
Tom, I have one more thought, if I could.
Yeah, Erika, please.
So there's something in all of this, and this is a not even half-baked, quarter-baked thought, which is another observation from being in New York last week, is that I think we are seeing the last throes of a mental model about the sovereignty of nations and prioritizing national defense over collective security. And I'm not suggesting naively that.
Erika, you're on mute.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I just got muted. Sorry, I don't know where I was, but I think there's an interesting tension emerging right now between the awareness that the problems we face, and this is certainly described in the pact, the problems we face require collective response, require collaboration, and really require that we reimagine and redefine what it means to be secure in the world in ways that go way beyond these, sort of antiquated notions of, say, national security. And, criticisms that way of thinking is idealistic, I think are simply cynical, because security is being redefined in homes all over the world right now, from Asheville, North Carolina, to Mombasa, to Tuvalu, right? What it means for us to be secure in this world, and the promises of the pact, are going to require a kind of cooperation that is really actually a paradigm shift from what we've seen over the last, since 1945, really, since World War II. And I think this is up against a tension of the realities of the world we're in right now, and obviously the ways in which things could potentially begin to fall apart. But there's something in this moment that I think is really important. It is a tension, recognizing that we cannot continue to prioritize sovereign interests over the collective well-being of people and the inseparability of human and planetary security. It is now and has always been inseparable. Maybe we're beginning to recognize that in new ways. So it's an interesting sort of push me, pull you. I don't know if anybody read Dr. Dolittle, but it's an interesting kind of creative tension that I think we're all having to live with right now.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that part of it is we've outgrown the old multilateralism and the old ways of doing, acting, thinking, and we need to, in addition to, it's both and, right? How do we create new spaces, include diverse peoples, diverse voices, and kind of the systems change is, like Melody said, it's inside out and outside in. So how do we create this systemic change? And Tamsin.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating to hear all the perspectives, and I'm really sorry I wasn't in New York, but glad to hear these. But I wanted to just ask a question of, any and all of you, and Michael also, I know that you've been tagged once in this, but thinking about this was Climate Week. I think it's fascinating, Benjamin, that you said there are 11 signatories on the climate philanthropy out of 800, which is like not even 2%. And this was Climate Week in the US. And I'm just wondering, is part of that how we have been siloing philanthropy, that we talk about climate philanthropy or futures or polycrisis or indigenous philanthropy? And, so is one part of that because we're not, it's not fully representative of what philanthropy is focusing on? And to the conversation that we are having in the future around this is, is the naming of climate philanthropy or polycrisis philanthropy, is that part of the problem that's also keeping what Melody spoke about, the kind of verticals as opposed to the horizontal? But I would also be fascinated, therefore, in that question to you, Michael, because you are working on climate change and you're in the US. How representative do you think that 1% is really of what's happening? And how does one change that? Or is it necessary to change that if, in fact, we're talking about a philanthropy that is just being tagged differently? So I know Benjamin, Melody, and Michael, you will all have some comments, but Pubala and Erica talking about other kinds of philanthropies. I know you've been there. So I just love to know those thoughts.
It's hard to generalize. So it's hard to answer this question, but I think it is true that there are very few philanthropies that are working on climate and nature both. People get stuck in their lanes, and I think also just the human brain has a hard time dealing with too many systems at the same time. And we're all specialized, so it's really a problem. But, thanks to Sam Ballmer and Bezos to some degree too, there are some big places where there is a climate and nature philanthropy integration being attempted. But it's terrible to be relying on two giant philanthropies to do all the work that needs to happen in this integration, because it won't work, right? We all need to be part of it. So, Benjamin, I'm not surprised it's only 11. It makes me sad to hear that. But I think there are ways that this is beginning to be more actualized. I think one of the really good news conversations that happened in New York last week was around this thing that was written about in the New York Times today called the Tropical Forests Forever Facility. Some people call it the Tropical Forest Finance Facility. But if you look that up in the Times today, it's a really big idea that is a solution to climate, to nature, and to economic development, alternative economic development. And there aren't too many things out there that have attempted to try to address those three things. And underneath those three things are a lot of other things like indigenous people and, local, federal, and local, international, and finance. And, there's just a whole bunch of stuff that fits into this terrible acronym, awkward acronym, the TFFF. But it is a big global solution that is much more integrative than almost any other big potential global solution that's on the table today. And that's super interesting. And I think we may come at it backwards in that somehow now there's a big idea. New York Times wrote about it today. So it must be a big idea. And people will begin to get attracted to it. And you'll start to see people who work on the pieces come together to make the whole happen. And, it's worth looking into. It really is a big idea. It's like a once in a generation idea. And we've been tracking it for a while and hoping and praying. And I'm kind of a little bit optimistic. It's a possibility. It's really interesting. And we should all be thinking about it. Benjamin, I hope you and your foundations that are thinking bigger about these broader things can pay a little bit of attention to it, because I think it will really matter. So anyway, philanthropy is weird. It's always weird. Too much testosterone, too many egos, too many too much competition. It's not the place to go for big holistic thinking typically anyway. So it can be, but it doesn't work out that way that often. So anyway, so that's what I'd say about philanthropy for what it's worth. The only other thing I'd say about the U.S. is that it's unfortunate, but it's hard in the political context we're in to do more than be thinking about swing districts and swing states. We are down in the micro in the U.S. right now. And so it's about the vice presidential, event 2 nights ago with, Waltz and Vance, and it's very small stuff that is rising to the top. So, and it's not politically beneficial to talk about climate change in the New York in the U.S. Presidential debate, unfortunately. So it doesn't get talked about. And so as a result, we're in this very binary situation where we could have a good outcome or a really bad outcome. Good isn't guaranteed, bad is guaranteed, I think. So, it's hard to be doing the planning and so on. But I'm hopeful that if we get a good outcome, some of these bigger conversations about more integrated thinking and about nature and climate and economic development can come back to the top of the framing. But I think we're stuck until after November 6th or 7th or whatever the date is to be able to actually overtly see that conversation happening at the U.S. federal level. So
don't miss it, Michael. It's the 5th, right?
5th, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll be there on the 5th.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Upal, Melody, and Benjamin, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I'm thinking about elections because that's a really interesting point, and I think this year was quite unique in recent history, where I think majority of humanity is voting this year. There are like big elections in many different parts of the world, and I think the thing about political narrative and rhetoric is there is an overemphasis on individual security and national security. Right. And a lot of that, obviously, in the current political climate tends to be more fear-based than hope-based. It reminded, Michael, your points reminded me of the way we at Horizon 2045 has started thinking about security is through always and only through a scalar lens. So any sort of signal of change that we look at or study, we definitely look at its cascading impacts through time and in relation to other adjacent issue spaces. So intersectionality, but also think about how is the impact of this issue or the maturity of this issue going to unfold across different scales of security. So from individual to community to national to regional, global, and planetary. And I think that framing has been really useful for us, just like Erica was saying, is that distinction between what is in national interest and what is in planetary interest is going to blur as we move into a period of heightened climate crisis and other kinds of crises. And I think to really be able to, those of us working towards these goals, I think need to get better at making it visible for people, that connection between their individual security and something that's to do with global and planetary security, because from where we sit and what we see immediately in front of us, sometimes it's not possible, it's not visible for people, and that's exactly the connection we need to make really, really obvious because it exists. And if my memory is serving me right, I think a year ago there were discussions at the Security Council to make climate change a more front and center part of the Security Council's agenda. And on one hand, it wasn't, it makes me sad to say that India was one of the countries that opposed that. But at the same time, I think that resolution had a maximum number of co-sponsors in the history of the Security Council, right? So there is definitely momentum. But when I look at the pact, I don't think that we were able to integrate climate as a core agenda within the Security Council's piece. And I think that continues to be a huge gap from all of this, because climate security is not separate from big S security anymore. And if the Security Council's role is to prevent conflict, a number of conflicts in the coming years are going to be driven by the climate crisis. So I think that distinction is artificial and superficial at this point.
Okay, thanks, Bhupal. We'll go Melody, Benjamin, and then pick up on Darren's comments in the chat. So, Melody?
Yeah, I just want to go back to philanthropy when we talk about philanthropy in America versus, like Benjamin talked about only 2% of the, not just 2% of the foundations have signed this. I had the privilege of just been talking to a lot of European foundations lately. And one of the things that we were talking about is that, European foundations are very siloed and very traditional and conservative in their giving. And we look to America as the leader, actually, like, the American foundations, they're doing lots of stuff in climate. So I'm just really interested to know why there's such a, like Benjamin, you talk about there's not enough foundations in America is doing that. But at the same time, in other places that we think American foundations are more advanced in some way. And I had a very interesting conversation with a Nordic foundation where they were saying that maybe we should look at new ways of investing in climate because we all have our mandate, but climate is this thing out there. So maybe we should create like an investment kind of scheme to do that on the side. And they want to actually talk to other Nordics and who are all very conservative. Same thing when I talk to the Brazilians as well. Like I was like, there are some like really great philanthropists. I was like, there are 3. The rest are all conservative. So I'd like to know more about that perception of U.S. foundations not into climate. And the other point is about inclusion and diversity inclusion. First of all, I feel philanthropy is very different in America or in this Western way of thinking, like philanthropy, and in Asia, for example. I see Asian philanthropy very, very different. There are lots of business ethics that involves with philanthropy as well that is not in this Western way of thinking. Like people just do things very differently. So this is how, when we deal with Asian philanthropists is, it's a little bit different. So philanthropy is different. So how can we talk about it in different ways instead of just one way of looking at it, criticizing it, or saying that we need to change? Another thing is about inclusion, diversity inclusion. This is where I think it's a great example of the inside out. So for me, diversity inclusion is not having guidelines, it's not having check boxes, it's not having, those things does nothing to me. Like I feel like deep empathy and how everybody should change. It's not about you as a leader saying, let's have this guideline and check boxes and hire more people that's diverse. No, I want leaders to change yourself. You need to change. You need to do the work. That change have to come from the inside out, cannot come from the outside in. Absolutely not. So that's also, I feel like it's an example of this love-centered, as someone was saying, on climate change as well. Is that also something that, changing outside is not enough?
Thanks, Melody. Benjamin, we'll come to you and then we'll go to Darren because he's actually drawing out a lot of the points we've been talking about. So.
Tom, I noticed that
Benjamin, you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
I get confused. I got confused between the lower end button and the unmute, so I thought I was done with the unmuting, but I just had lowered my hand. Great. Yeah, no, I was just saying that it was great to to hear all these reflections and also to listen to Michael. Important to note that Rockefeller Brothers Fund is one of the 11, and not only a signatory but also a partner and a supporter of the Philanthropy for Climate movement. So grateful for that, and also showing that yes, there's obviously leadership in the US around these issues. But there were a lot of great questions raised. And so I would say there's a paradox that indeed in the US, there are, a number of very big foundations that invest massively. And so I would say the bulk of, I mean, we should check the Climate Works numbers and data, but I think probably a good majority of the climate philanthropy funding comes from the US, and you also have a couple of big ones in Europe like SIF and IKEA, but otherwise it's the Hewletts and the Bezos and some of these big donors from the US. So yes, but then they work and they define, as you said, as climate philanthropies, and so it's kind of seen as an area of work, and the others feel like, well, I'm not a climate philanthropy, so I'm not doing climate. And there's this old siloed thinking that prevails, and I think so. It's not just in the US, that thinking is everywhere. But I think in the US, it's a much more political question. It's divisive politically, the question of climate, which obviously it shouldn't be, but it's seen as a kind of a woke agenda by not even just the far right, very conservative, but even those who might, not identify as having a super progressive agenda. They feel climate is not for them. So there's this specificity, I would say, in the US context. But then I would also point the fact that the importance of having networks and sort of champions and leaders that can push for change, because I think the main reason why it's so strong in Europe and so weak in the US is that in Europe you had Philia and a number of national associations of foundations that have taken that commitment, that have pushed their members to sign on, and they managed to have great results. In the US, it hasn't happened, and one of the reasons is that, again, at Wings, we didn't want to say, hey, the climate funders group, please take the leadership and run this campaign in the US, because the whole point was to convince the non-climate donors. So we wanted to reach to the sort of the average foundations to help them understand the intersection with their work. And it's not that they need to drop what they're doing, but they're just going to do it more effectively if they have a more holistic approach and if they take that climate lens. And so we wanted to work with the more generalist networks that can bring them on board. But for them, it was very complicated because it's so political. So just, you have these two questions of the importance of networks and leadership that can push the agendas and get people to sign, etc. The specificities of the political context in the US, and just on a note of hope, it can change quite quickly. So I'm also hopeful in terms of how we could get quickly many more US foundations to sign on, because I've seen it in Brazil, for example. I mean, Wings is headquartered in Brazil. And so that's one of the first places where we said, hey, there's this thing happening in Europe. We're taking it global with Wings. Would you be interested in creating a national commitment for Brazil? And we talked to some of our members there. And the initial reaction, and it was the same in Colombia and other places, was like, well, we have more urgent problems. We have misery, we have inequality, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, climate. Later we'll talk about trees and birds, and a few big international donors are doing this, and that's good because they're also repairing their debt, and that was the kind of, so in the beginning it sounded like it was going to be a really hard, and we didn't want also to impose any agenda. So, but then we involved them in this Philanthropy for Climate movement, and there were a few, like 4 or 5 foundations and network in Brazil that came to COP in the delegation, engaged with others, and they came back transformed. And now, just a few months later, they launched the national commitments in Brazil. They integrated climate as one of the pillars, like the big strategic priorities of the National Association of Foundations in Brazil, GIFE, and others also already Comua. So it has become a thing very quickly, because it was just a matter of understanding that this is not separate from what they're doing. If they want to address racial equity, gender issues, inequality, peace, etc., they need to integrate that lens, and they will just be even more effective if they do so. And once that is triggered, I think there can quickly be action and change. So just ending on a positive note also.
Thanks, Benjamin. I do want to draw us back to Darren's comments in the chat box, and Darren had to jump off because he had another meeting. Darren and I have been colleagues and friends for a number of years and worked together. He's actually a master facilitator. But he asked us about George Bernard Shaw, about there are things that look at the way things are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. And if we draw upon Meadows' wisdom about systems change and how to create systems change, it is Melody's how do we change from within so we can act better and more effectively outside. And it's about how do we change with Meadows' principles of what systems change looks like. How do we change the rules of the game, the structures, the norms, expand the boundaries of caring? And I think part of these shifts have to do with bringing in the next generation, the generation, and that's going to help be a part of the change. And he's less interested in learning the system as it exists and how to infiltrate and be a player in, and how can we envision something that's not yet in place. So I think that's kind of really key. He's also a student of Reverend James Lawson, who was actually Martin Luther King's advisor, and Dr. Lawson just passed away actually a couple of months ago. And we as a people do not have the world we are capable of having. And this is something that Dr. Lawson actually was he's the one that influenced Dr. Martin Luther King in the nonviolent. Lawson was a student of Gandhi and then spent some time in India actually, and then was kind of sat on the right-hand side of Dr. Martin Luther King in his lifetime. So anyway, there's a lot of inspiration from generation and cross-generation. So yeah, Erica.
Yeah, I want to come back to what you were mentioning, Tom, about us not having the world that we're capable of having. I think we also don't have a world, we have not imagined the world that we want in vivid enough detail. We've been experimenting a little bit at Horizon 2045 with something called Far Futures, which was at some point, if I can come to it, I'll put it in the chat. But basically, it's a collection of extraordinary stories about the year 2095. And these commissioned pieces from some of the world's leading science fiction authors and others, what we asked them to do was to imagine, just as a thought experiment, that by the year 2045, we'd been able to disarm the final nuclear weapon, right? Nuclear weapons have really constrained the foreign policy environment for, since their inception, and in some ways have really limited our imagination about what's possible in terms of greater cooperation in the world. And so we asked these writers to say, if we had done that, if we had decommissioned the last nuclear weapon at that point mid-century, 50 years later, what could have been unleashed by having that success? What would have been unleashed financially, culturally, psychically for us? What would become possible? And what we realized in doing this effort is that by picking one doorway to walk through, which in this case it happens to have been nuclear weapons, obviously we just pinned down one tiny little corner. What becomes interesting is when we have vivid depictions of a world in which we have both solved some of our climate challenges and solved other challenges that we're all working on. So a useful way of backcasting from a vivid depiction to think about the things that are within our grasp over the next 5 to 10 years, the kinds of interventions that actually might ameliorate challenges across different systems of security. So we're very interested in, and I wonder, Pupil, if you can talk a little bit about this, paying attention to the signals of change around us that help us to have a better magnet to draw us to a world that actually is better for more in more ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the beauty of protopian thinking and protopian visioning when we do futures work. I think a lot of times misconceive that step as being connected to naive optimism, but really the function of imagining better futures is that you can return to the very first step of long-term thinking, which is about sensing signals of change in the present and really looking now this time for green shoots that could be presenting breadcrumbs to those futures that otherwise seem quite difficult, almost impossible. And Erica, what you were just saying actually reminded me of a session that happened as one of the side events that was hosted by elders on Friday morning before we went into the summit. And there was a conversation about nuclear weapons and disarmament. They said that, a lot of the times people will come into the rooms and into these conversations and they'll acknowledge these are brilliant, these are great ideas, but they're just so impossible. They don't seem possible. And I think that is where futures thinking comes in. It opens up the aperture of what seems possible, not because we're just flexing our imaginative muscle, but because we're actually looking for evidence of that possibility in the present moment. So in our work, the Far Future stories, they explore a whole gamut of possibilities from, if we are able to disarm, does that then give us a blueprint for other ways of retiring technologies that do more harm than good? For example, right? What unlocks as a result of achieving one ambitious goal? But at the same time, we have stories that really underscore the importance of knowing that just because we do away with one evil doesn't magically cure everything that ails our society, right? Racism continues to be something to address. Climate change continues to be something to address, but we're better equipped, having done one difficult thing, to get behind those matters. And I think in our scanning, one of the signals that I have been sharing in the past few weeks with people around green shoots is really looking at the same signal and being able to appreciate both sides of that coin. So one of the things that came up in our scanning data is how climate change is beginning to have great disruptive effect on spiritual rituals across the world, whether it's the Hajj pilgrimage that the Muslims perform in Middle East, whether it's the Badrinath Yatra in my country that's performed by Hindu pilgrims every year because of excessive heat in one case, and in this case because of flooding and displacement. Or in North America, indigenous communities are seeing movement of sacred animals outside of ancestral lands. They're seeing shrinking of sacred rivers. And so obviously all of those things are terrible things. They have real negative impact on people's lives and cultures. But at the same time, this might be exactly the kind of thing that might catalyze religious groups and institutions to perhaps become the greatest advocates for climate action, right? So that's what protopian thinking really leans into, is to look at what's happening today and think about ways in which it might catalyze exactly the kind of bold thinking and shift in values, beliefs, and mental models that we need for transformative futures.
Thanks, Upal. Jane, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you did comment that you learned two new words. And would you mind telling us, coming off mute and telling us why those words spoke to you?
Well, I've only just Googled what protopia means. So, I can't give a lot of expertise, but I think there's something interesting about something that's not a utopia or a dystopia. And it makes me think of prototype as well. And prototyping different worlds. So I thought that was cool and interesting. And I'll just say hello to people because I haven't been part of this community here, although I know Horizon 2045 and their work, and I think it was through one of their LinkedIn posts that I came across this. I'm in London in the UK, so the sun is setting here at the moment. And I work, like Erica, on nuclear weapons for a group called the European Leadership Network, based in London and Berlin. It's been a really fascinating discussion. So thanks very much for organising it and for the inclusive approach to bringing everyone into the conversation.
Yeah, if Nicholas were with us, and he sends his regrets because he was sick, but he would tell us about the artistic and the music and some of the non-cerebral approaches to change. And I know, Stan, you and I have talked about that a little bit. Stan teaches tango and is really into music as well, and is seeing these other non-cerebral and deeper spiritual things that need to be behind and drive the change, the shift in values, right? So anyone else want to speak out and speak up?
A quick thing on this. Pupil and I walked away from last week thinking, wouldn't it be extraordinary if every year at UNGA we had a space, you can imagine some warehouse space that we could walk into, where we could have people from all over the world who are working on different pieces of this giant puzzle in front of us, who could have an experience together. An experience that is as much imaginatively evocative and physically evocative as it is intellectually rigorous. So what could it be like not to sit in the back of a room and listen to speaker after speaker after speaker after speaker until you're absolutely exhausted, but in fact to explore these issues from the role of philanthropy to the possibilities for reframing our economic systems, but in a highly experiential way, almost as if it were a piece of theater, which would essentially be a sort of interactive planning and sense-making environment. And so I know that's highly specific, but I think the point I'm trying to make is, as we all come together in these vast convenings and 150,000 people descend on Midtown Manhattan, aren't there alternative ways for us to be together about these issues and to reimagine this work in ways that could be more invigorating? So I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, thanks for that, because that's actually I geek out on these questions because I consider myself, 76 years old and a facilitator. And so how do you create spaces where people and ideas and thoughts come together and create new meanings and create new actions and new commitments? So that really speaks. And if Jerry were with us, Jerry had to teach class today. If Jerry were with us, he would say, what is it? Like you're saying, what are the new forms? What are the new spaces and structures that we can create that don't necessarily even call for face-to-face meetings, but can bring us together in a decentralized way, not just in New York or not just in some capital, but how can we talk and have these conversations and the sharing of values across generations, across regions, across sectors, and that's become much, much richer because it's draws upon issues and people that matter. So
well, I never stop finding it interesting and ironic that, we've been talking a lot about philanthropy, but we don't really talk about the phil part of that word, the love part. And so I appreciated the fact that Darren used the word love in his post in the chat, which, by the way, doesn't happen in every meeting I go to. I can promise you that. And so what would it be like actually to have an experience that is about human connection? Not about the ideas first, not about the concepts or the striving first, but it's about human connection and being in a space where we're actually able to have conversations that we can't have anywhere else because we're bringing our full self to the discussion. So I sort of mentioned theater, you mentioned music. I would just put out there the possibility that collectively we could do something in these spaces that hasn't been done before because we're trying to create a world that hasn't existed before.
And that's the challenge. Yeah. Sterling, go for it.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sterling Dean. I work for the United Institutions Foundation, and we're actually making an investment in something like what you're talking about, and as well you, Tom, about looking into how do we create an enabling environment to allow us for system change to work together in a more holistic manner and with integrated approaches, and to bring in stakeholders together. As we're doing that at the global level, it's going to be we see as a complement to the UN, where it's going to bring in together not only philanthropy, but the private sector, scientific community, civil society, academic institutions for a permanent platform to enable them to work together. And I just want to kind of reflect on some of the things that I saw in the Summit of the Future We've been in this game for a long time, looking at the whole issue about the global governance, and for a long time there has been no conversation about it at all. Within the UN, there's been talk about strengthening civil society engagement and private sector engagement back to the 66, in the 90s. In 2004, there was a Cardoso report that looked about how can we strengthen engagement and collaboration, and it always kind of falls through. And this is the first time since 2004 where there has even been conversation at all about global governance. So we like the fact that there actually been conversation about global governance, because we think that that needs to be central to the conversation in order for us to find ways to move forward. So that in itself is a great step. I think that we should celebrate the fact that we actually had a summit and we talked about it. That being said, right now the international environment is very broken. There's a lot of animosity between different centers, and countries are not really agreeing on a lot of stuff. So what we see in the Pact for the Future is that there's a lot of recommitments to existing agreements, which is good, because one of the steps was to reaffirm the commitment to multilateralism, and I think that's very important. However, and I think there were some good steps like the reorganization of the financial architecture. I think it's very important. However, there's a lot of stuff that was missing that we see, that we feel are really required in order for us to be able to achieve the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Agreement, and to enable stakeholders to work together. And all of you have been speaking about these issues, and we see that a lot of other sectors are talking about the same issues, whether it's scientific or the civil society, even the private sector. We're talking about the silos, that we need to work in integrated approaches, that we need to be able to build trust, better strategic relationships across sectors, between institutions, and across the pillars as well, between sustainable development, climate, peace, security, human rights, and humanitarian aid. Even the UN frameworks are separated, and we need to be able to work across those. So we see that we really need to invest in those areas. It's not enough just to in order to break those silos, we need to come up with methodologies and ways of working, and invest in our capacity to engage in those ways, but also create the networks and platforms. So what Benjamin is talking about is that the importance of the leadership in this area, that people speak out about it, and we create the networks. And what we're doing with our platforms actually to create an enabling environment and an organizing principle that would allow the different sectors to work together. Now, from our side, it's very interesting to hear what you guys talk about the philanthropy, that it's so separate as well, that there's so many silos. So what Wings are doing and the Net 4 thing, we think they're super important. And I think that it's important for us to engage and also bring in other philanthropies to discuss this issue, see how we can contribute also, but how we can actually meet together at the global level together with other, like with member states, etc. So I just want to thank you for that. And yeah, I have a question. This is, if you guys see, what's the openness in philanthropy for organizations within different sectors in philanthropy to actually engage in this conversation and make that change? Because I think that's super key. Investing in governance is, if philanthropy wants some really important role, it's actually, apart from their own silos, is to invest in governance, invest in enabling not only philanthropy to work together, but everybody else. I just put out if anybody wants to comment on that issue. Thanks.
Sterling. Yeah, it's about.
Sorry, Tom.
Go ahead, Tamsin.
If I can just.
Go ahead.
Sorry. If I can just raise that actually later in November, one of Michael's colleagues, actually, Stephen Hines, who published a paper in June this year called Logic for the Future, will actually be doing a conversation on reimagining global cooperation and humanitarian futures with the head of the International Federation of Red Cross in Europe and with Indy Johar from Dark Matters Labs. And that actually might be, we have also previously had a conversation on governance, so I agree with you. And certainly with Wings, we will look at how we bring that conversation in. But if you want to come to the 20th, it might really be something that you're speaking to.
I did actually sign up for that. Actually, I heard about it. I mean, I spoke to Stephen about this many years ago, and he finds he finds important of leveling the playing field, not only from a standpoint of creating the type of engagement that at the UN for all the other sectors, but also addressing power balances. That's going to be very important. And that does need to be programmed into networks as well, so that there's a possibility for bigger and larger organizations to be able to work together in a more inclusive manner. So, but I will be there for sure. Thank you, Tom.
No, great.
Thank you.
And to create these spaces, I'm trying to build on what I'm hearing everybody says, to create spaces where, as Melody says, we're connecting on connection. And it's not about necessarily an issue or a cerebral issue, but it's how do we connect, as Stan said, on different levels. So Stan, I want to give you a moment to mention your point about dancing. And then Benjamin, you've raised your hand, and then we'll give a minute. We're coming up to the top of the hour and time to close out. So Stan, and then Benjamin, and then we'll close out.
Just quickly here. One of my takeaways from Climate Week is that these conversations have felt very familiar, actually. Tamsin has been leading and working with the Resilience Funders Network for quite a while now. We've been talking about cross-silo work. We've been talking about polycrisis. We've been talking about intersectional issues. We've been talking about collaborating and how to bridge between different pieces to work on larger systems here. And one of my takeaways from Climate Week is that I did not feel that there was a tremendous amount of progress that has been made in the 5 or 6 years that we've been doing this, from what I heard in Climate Week. I think that's the audience. I think the level. I think the interest has expanded, but the quality and the outcomes of those conversations have not necessarily progressed at the same pace. And I think that's something for us to note. This is inherently a challenging topic for us to work on, and talking about the fundamental substrates that we communicate on, I think, is one of the ways that we can try to work on that challenging issue. But I was a little disheartened from Climate Week from that perspective. 1 minute left, done.
Okay, thanks, Stan. Yeah. Benjamin, you had your hand up?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to quickly respond to what Dean was saying, and agreed. I mean, that's also how we see the agenda for change at Wings, is that in the context of polycrisis, with all this intersectionality, this complexity, etc., embracing systems change, it's not just like being like a super sophisticated institution that has like very smart strategies to actionate that lever and great theory of change, then wow, you get that systemic level, outcome. I think it's too much unpredictable, it's too complex, and that means we just need to try to be enablers for others. And so enablers for markets, for governments, for civil society, for other donors, other philanthropies, that's the best we can do. And so one of the key messages for us in this framework is to say, well, exactly what he was saying, like build the bridges, like support the connectors, support those who are going to connect the pipes that will then create the solutions, because you cannot engineer that in a top-down way in today's world. And so being systemic means investing in networks. It means investing in all the, this field building, and there's very little investment happening right now. And so I just wanted to support, and it's one of the key messages that we have at the heart of the Philanthropy Transformation agenda that we're working on with RFN and Omega and a lot of other Wings members. So just wanted to support that, and also the sort of the governance question at large, and understanding it's not just about the sort of the UN Security Council, and then it's just like the big foundation can have, it's also the local governance. It can be done. It's a mindset, as it was said, and so we first need to change that mindset, and then it could be applied at all levels.
Beautiful point. It's about creating spaces where different people can come together and co-create solutions together. Because actually, maybe the solutions, some exist, some don't. Tamsin, do you want to close out for us? Because we're at the top of the hour, maybe a minute or two over. And thanks for everybody's patience and participation.
No, I'd just really like to thank everyone for speaking and presenting their reflections and contributing to the conversation, and Michael, Sterling, and Stan, and really look forward to the next conversation, and hopefully how we can build on all of these issues, which I think we've got a bit of a mixed, but I think really this conversation shows why the dialogues that are coming up are so mixed, because actually we are trying to cut across these spaces and more horizontally connect. So I'm very grateful, Melody, Pupil, Erica, Benjamin, thank you, and thank you to the Wings team as well. And Tom, as ever, great to have you facilitate.
Well, my parting shot is that no ego, spaces where there's no egos, no silos, no logos, no halos, but we come together and try to, there's a Greek concept of dialogue, which is the creation of meaning among a group of people where each of us comes in and brings what we have, but together we achieve much more because we learn how to create together solutions or approaches that address the issue. So it's not about discussion, percussion, concussion. It's about the creation of meaning together that goes beyond what any of us could have done individually. So thanks, everybody. Let's have we can learn this in Kenya, saying goodbye at the end of a good session. You clap 3 times and you give your gratitude to the group, to the collective, and then you collect 3 times and take that gratitude because you also contribute. So let's do that closing. If you don't mind, come off screen and let's, everybody ready? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.